where the Cornish Rebellion started. And it started in Cornwall, down on the Lizard, in a parish called St. Keverne. It's not actually St. Keverne, a typical Cornish village at all, because unlike the majority of villages in Cornwall, its buildings, as you can see in the slides here, are grouped around a central square. And the parish church is unusual as well, because it's got a spire, and there aren't that many spires in that part of Cornwall at all. And it's thought that this was added actually to help mariners navigate and avoid the treacherous Manacle rocks, which are just off the coast in at St. Keverne. And the churchyard, actually, you can just about see it through the picture here. It's got a lot of memorials to people who failed to navigate round the Manacle rocks. But it's also unusual because it's a particularly large parish. It's got 10 miles of coastline, a number of scattered hamlets within it, and dangerously for the authorities in the past, there was no single landlord to keep an eye on the population. It was a large scattered population, but there was no one landlord who could act as the sort of leader, the person that could keep a lid on things. And as a result of that, this rather isolated parish, over the years, particularly in the Tudor period, became a hotbed of rebellion. There were disturbances in 1537. It got involved in the Prayer Book Rebellion in 1548 to 1549. And as we're going to hear, in 1497, it was the flashpoint of a major uprising, which is the one that's gone down in history as the Cornish March on London. Although the rising began in Cornwall, its immediate cause really can be seen 500 miles away, in fact, and Henry VII's desire to deal with the man that's known as Perkin Warbeck and his sponsor, who was James IV of Scotland. Now, Warbeck had been claiming to be Edward IV's son, Richard, and he'd been plaguing Henry VII for years. And in 1496, he showed up in Scotland, where James, who I think whether he believed whether Warbeck was Edward's son or not was irrelevant. This was an opportunity to make mischief, I think, for Henry VII. So he took him under his wing, married him off to one of his relatives, a fairly distant relative, and recognised him as the King of Scotland, King of England, excuse me. And in early 1497, the pair, in other words, James IV, that you can see here, and Perkin Warbeck, they crossed the border at the head of an army, and they lay siege to this place, which is Norham Castle, described by Walter Scott actually as the most dangerous place in England. The reason being that it's right next to Scotland, basically. And other than Carlisle, I can't think of any other English fortification that underwent so many sieges. Well, anyway, James and Perkin Warbeck and their army laid siege to at Norham. They even hauled that Mons Meg cannon that you can see in Edinburgh Castle down out of Edinburgh to assist with the bombardment. Now, the siege actually was a failure. It didn't last very long. The invasion was over within a week. But the prospect of future invasions led Henry VII to decide to take preemptive action himself and remove this threat of an invasion of his northern border. So what he would do was to mount a counter-invasion of his own. Of course, this cost money. And so to fund this enterprise, English Parliament voted one way or another, Henry VII, with £120,000 in taxes. Now, this was a colossal sum at the time, and it was more than anything else paid in any other year of his reign. And so by the spring of 1497, Henry had started to raise a large-ish, perhaps 10,000 people, and relatively well-equipped army, which he placed under command of this guy, who you can see on the right here, Giles Lord Daubeny. Anyway, after Bosworth, Daubeny became one of Henry's most trusted adherents, and he served him in a number of ways as a soldier, as an administrator, and as a diplomat. And he was given a lot of offices and a great deal of land. And this made him one of the most influential people in the country. This is his tomb, incidentally, in Westminster Abbey. So he was one of the most influential people in the country, but especially in the southwest, where he was very much Henry VII's man in the southwest. Now, this made him popular with those people that enjoyed his patronage, people that got jobs from him or were in his household. but it made him less popular with those people who didn't enjoy his patronage or had lost influence because of his promotion. So there's our man. So he's the person that's going to lead the invasion of Scotland. However, just as Daubney's forces were heading north, so they're coming up north of London, they've all gathered together and they're heading up to the Midlands, Henry got very worrying news, and that was that a rebellion had broken out in, and of all places, it was in Cornwall. Now, obviously, Cornwall still is, I think, markedly different in character, isn't it, to its English counterparts to the east. And it still, at that time, maintained a strong independent national identity. And, you know, a substantial number of the population there still spoke Cornish. But you'd have thought that for a king like Henry, who made a lot of his Celtic ancestry, that this would be the not most obvious place for a rebellion to break out. But the warning signs actually have been there, because in the previous year, there'd been arguments over the new regulations for the very important tin mining industry in Cornwall. And it led Henry to suspend the privileges of the Cornish stannaries. Now, the word stannary comes from the Latin word meaning tin. And stannary laws, basically, they imposed obligations on the tin miners of Cornwall and Devon. But in return, it gave them privileges. So, for example, they could hold their own courts. And crucially, they were exempt from royal taxation. Well, the removal of these privileges caused grumbling amongst the Cornish anyway. And then when Henry's tax officials turned up, you know, with these swingeing tax demands that everybody had to pay, things got out of hand. Because in the eyes of the Cornish, they were being asked to pay what was an incredibly heavy tax, for which they'd previously been exempt from. And to make matters worse, it was to fund a war that was 500 miles away, and which they considered had nothing to do with them. And the early epicenter of what rapidly developed into quite a major uprising was indeed the parish of St. Devon, where the protests were led by two individuals. This is a modern statue of them. Michael Joseph, who is on the right, popularly known as Anne Goff, which was the Cornish for blacksmith. And Michael Joseph and his followers headed up to Bodmin, where they picked up a second leader in the form of the guy on the left here, who is holding a legal document in his hand. And he was a local lawyer called Thomas Flamanck. Now, interestingly, Flamanck's family were quite big players in local government. His father was actually one of the agents that Henry had sent down to impose the tax. And his father, and indeed his younger brother, had served as MPs. And indeed, his younger brother would later become a yeoman of the guard, and he married the deputy governor of Calais. So this was a family that were not natural rebels. Not at all. They were very legalistic in their approach. They were lawyers, but they were not natural rebels. And I think what happened was that our man here who joined the rebellion, I think Thomas Flamanck thought that perhaps he could restrain and control the rebellion and perhaps prevent its excesses. So I think what he was trying to do was to say, right, well, I'm going to get a grip on this and I'll make sure that the rebellion or the rising or the protest doesn't get out of hand. It's a risky strategy, though, as, for example, Robert Ashe will find out during the Pilgrimage of Grace, because, you know, you get associated with a rising or a protest, and it's very easy to become tarred with the same brush as the rebels, you know, and indeed that's what happened to Flamanck. But anyway, Flamanck did try and restrain what the protest against the tax should be about. And it was very much not about overthrowing Henry VII in any way whatsoever. They were quite firm about this. It was, and as so many rebellions are, it's not against the king, it's against his evil counsellors. And what Flamanck persuaded the Cornish to do was to march on London, to present a petition to the king calling for the withdrawal of the tax and for the punishment of the royal advisors that they considered were responsible for them, notably Archbishop Morton, who was Henry's tax advisor, and Sir Reginald Bray, who you may well have come across. Now, according to the Tudor historian Edward Hall, who wrote about an account of this, he said they resolved to do no damage to any creature, only to see punishment and correction done to such persons as who were the authors and causers of these unreasonable exactions and demands. So in other words, we're talking here about Morton and Bray. They're not blaming the king in any way. It's his, as they put it, his evil advisors. So all of this at this stage, it's quite clear it's not going to be destruction. It's a protest. And so they left Cornwall and they made for Exeter. Now, how many people left Cornwall? Well, a relatively recent book on Bosworth and the surrounding events claimed that 15,000 Cornish left to make this protest, 15,000. And you get that figure bandied around, but you need to actually have a little look at how many people are actually in Cornwall in the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. And it appears that the population of Cornwall at that time was 60,000. So 60,000 people living in Cornwall. Now, half of those are going to be women, and a third of who was left are going to be children, and maybe a quarter would be old or infirm. So that leaves us with 15,000 able-bodied men in Cornwall. So if 15,000 people Cornishmen are going to leave Cornwall to protest, it means that every able-bodied Cornishman had to join this rising, which clearly is not going to be the case. And on top of which, the logistics of feeding that number of people, especially if you're going to try and be law-abiding and not live off the land and nick stuff from the places that you go through, would be impossible. So that number is clearly an exaggeration. That's not to say, though, that other people didn't join the rebellion as it turned out, the rebellion. They're still calling it a protest at this stage. Well, the first place they come through out of Cornwall is Exeter. Now, there was no attempt by the people in Devon to stop the rebels. They could have perhaps made a stand at the bridge, but they didn't want to get involved. But interestingly, very few Devonians actually joined the protest either, probably partly because of their traditional antipathy to who they saw as foreign people, the Cornish, but also because Devon still had its stannary privileges. The things that had been taken away from the Cornish tin miners had not happened to the Devon tin miners. They accepted new regulations in, I think, 1494, so they were exempt from the tax. So they wouldn't join the marchers. But as the marchers left Exeter and moved up into Somerset, things would be a completely different matter altogether. And we know a little bit about who joined this protest, because afterwards Henry, who was never one for executing people, issued a lot of fines, and we know who got fined. And it does appear that an awful lot of gentry from Somerset and Dorset actually joined the protest. And now, why would they do that? Well, partly it's been suggested that it's because many of them were old Lancastrians who felt that they hadn't been sufficiently sort of rewarded for their family's sufferings in the Wars of the Roses. So it might be that, or it might be, in fact, that some of them, and certainly I think this was the case, were people that had missed out on the sort of Daubney bonus, that they were people that had not been selected by Daubney, or they'd lost influence because of Daubney. So maybe they saw this as an opportunity to express their discontent. Anyway, the protesters marched from Exeter to Taunton, and it was there that there was the first blood of the rising that was shed, when a royal tax collector, a hated royal tax collector, who was actually from Cornwall, was hunted down and murdered there. But that was the only bloodshed, really, that there would be for some time. Now, the Cornish and their allies, they then moved on from there, and they moved to Wells. Now, in Wells, quite a significant thing happened, because they were joined by James Touchet, 7th Lord Audley. So they now actually have a member of the peerage who is supporting the protest openly. It's quite possible that others kind of quietly supported it, but he openly became the leader of the protest. Now, there isn't an image of Touchet, but these are his coat of arms, so this we'll have to do. Now, some accounts say that he was, you read this quite often, that he was an impoverished noble. Actually, he wasn't. He had plenty of money, but it seems that what he didn't like was the fact that he'd lost power and influence in the southwest. His father had been a key player in Edward IV's government, and Audley, I think, probably saw the tax protest as an opportunity to re-establish himself as a regional leader in place of Daubney. And it's also possible that he'd been in contact with Perkin Warbeck and saw him as a route back to power. But anyway, it may well be that a lot of Audley's motivation was based around his antipathy towards Giles Lord Daubeny. So after leaving Wales, the protesters moved to Salisbury in Wiltshire. And then you see they're going to the kind of key cathedral towns all the time when they're doing this, to see cities. You know, they go from one major place to another. Then they went to Winchester in Hampshire. And then on the 13th of June, they reached Farnham in Surrey. So not that far from where classic battlefield tours have their offices, in fact. Now, again, claims are sometimes said that by now they reached 15,000 people, but I think it's unlikely, actually. I think just the problems of supplying 15,000 people would have been insurmountable. And it's significant that, you know, even with the resources of the entire country and the government behind it, English armies in the Middle Ages very, very rarely were more than 15,000. So I think that, you know, that number, when you read it in the Chronicles, is really a number to say a lot of people had joined it. That's, I think, all that you can say about it. But nevertheless, this Cornish threat was taken seriously by Henry and his advisors. I mean, Henry was a cautious man, and, you know, he's going to take this seriously. And so members of the royal family were packed off to safety in the Tower of London, and Daubeny was ordered to hurry back down south. And he deployed his army on Hounslow Heath. So he was kind of ready to block an advance on London from the west, I would argue, you know, because from Guildford, that's the way you where eventually came, where you come up to London. Now, meanwhile, Henry was hurrying, setting out raising new forces. And he called on the services of old hands like John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, the victor of Bosworth Field, and the Battle of Stoke. Now, leaving Farnham, so we're now in June, the protesters made their way along the Hog's Back, which is a long, narrow ridge that some of you may be familiar with. It forms part of the North Downs. There it is in the distance here. And it now carries the A31. By the 14th, the protesters have marched along the Hog's Back. They haven't fought anybody yet. They've murdered one person, but they've not fought anybody. But that night, they make their camp on Gilddown. This is Gilddown. And it's a bit of high ground at the end of the Hog's Back that overlooks Guildford. That's Guildford Cathedral, you can see on the left. So the protesters are now, you know, they're within about 30 miles of London. And so they're within striking distance of London. But it was on the following day, it was Daubeny who actually struck first. So he comes down from Hounslow Heath. He detaches, according to the Great Chronicle of London, which is really the main source for this, he detaches 500 mounted spearmen from his army, so lancers probably, and launched them against the Cornish camp. So imagine that all these Cornish are up on this high ground here, and then they're attacked. Now, details of what happened here are very, very scanty. The Great Chronicle of London simply says that the spearmen bickered with the Cornish. So it was clearly not a major set-piece battle. It's going to be some kind of skirmish, I think. And it looks as though Daubeny's men killed some of the Cornish and they captured others, but it was very much an indecisive piece of fighting. The spearmen fell back to Daubeny's main army, and the rebels continued their march. Now, that area now is known as the Mount, and it's just up above Guildford, and it's still undeveloped. And there is, in fact, a memorial stone up here. Here it is, with inscriptions in Cornish and English, which was erected to mark the 500th anniversary of the Rising. But don't forget that whilst we're calling this the Cornish March to London, many of the people that joined it were actually from Somerset and Dorset as well. And so whilst, you know, we see it as a Cornish event, it's not a purely Cornish event. It's evidence, I think, of dissatisfaction amongst certain people in the southwestern counties. Now, okay, it was a minor skirmish that we're talking about here, but it was certainly a significant skirmish. Now, the first thing about it is that the followers of Audley, Angoff, the blacksmith, and Flamank have now actually crossed swords with the king's forces. Now, having done that, it's very difficult for them to maintain the argument that they were simply protesters. If you know the the spearmen turn up and their leader says, disperse in the name of the king, and these people don't. They've declared themselves really rebels. So that's the first significance about this incident at Gilddown above Guildford. The next thing I think is it's a clear message to the Cornish and their allies that they're not going to be allowed to march unopposed into London. And in fact, this may have had a contribution to the decision that they made not to head up to London via the west, up to Westminster, but to skirt around the south of London and make for Kent. And the reason for this was that Kent had a track record of supporting popular risings. As the Cornish trudged on eastwards, they went along the North Downs way towards North Kent. They would have gone through Sheer, a place which would have been very familiar to Audley. You might recognise it because it was where The Holiday was set, that film that you often see at Christmas. And this is the Church of St James at Audley and at Sheer. And it would have been very familiar to Audley because his Yorkist father had actually been granted one of the manors that made up Sheer, following the attainment of the previous owner, who was a Lancastrian, James Butler, Earl of Ormond. So his Yorkist father moved in there. Now, after Henry VII's victory at Bosworth, Butler got the place back, but he didn't really want it. So he granted it to Reginald Bray. Remember that Bray is one of the people that the rebels seek to overthrow. Now, actually, Bray didn't really want the manor either. So he rented it back to the Audleys. They had to pay money and to stay there. So whether there was a bit of a squabble over the ownership of the manor of Sheer, well, we will never know. But certainly it meant a lot to the Audleys, because when Audley's father died in 1490, he was buried in the parish church, and this is his memorial brass. So it clearly meant something to Audleys. And Audley Jr., with his Cornish rebels, probably went that route because he knew that route. 16th of June, the rebels reach Blackheath. In Kent. More high ground again, of course, like Gilddown, 4 miles southeast of London. And of course, Kent was a traditional rallying point for rebels who were planning to march on the capital. If you think about it, Wat Tyler with the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 and Jack Cade in 1450 had mustered their supporters there. So you can perhaps see why the rebels decided to head for there, that Kent had a tradition of popular rebellion and protest. But there would be no repetition of such events in 1497, unfortunately for the Cornish and their leaders. Instead of joining the Cornish, the inhabitants of Kent wanted no part in the rising at all, and they made themselves scarce. So the rebels were now very firmly on the back foot, and they set themselves up on Blackheath. So here's Blackheath, such as what remains. At the top of the screen, you can see the River Thames, and then you can see it meanders round. And top left is where the City of London is. You can see the high-rise buildings up there. So that was where London was. And then going left to right is the road that eventually would go down to London. The built-up the grassy area that you can see is Blackheath, and beyond it, where the trees are, is Greenwich Park. So this is where the rebels camped out, hopefully expecting, Kentish people to join them, but they never did. Meanwhile, Henry VII had been quite active, actually, and he moved his forces to St. George's Fields. Now, that's where, if you're familiar with it, it's where the Imperial War Museum is in London now. And the advantage of that was that it covered London Bridge, but also it was a base from which you could attack. So that's where he put his army, and it was a well-equipped army. Henry had guns, we know that. He had mounted troops. He had a lot of troops. He'd been joined there by, amongst others, Daubeney, but also the Earl of Oxford and many other nobles as well. So a well-equipped army just down the road. There's no way now that the rebels are going to get into London. And it does seem that rebel morale started to crumble at this point. I think they'd bitten off more than they could chew. And what had begun initially, if you think about it, as a local tax protest down in St. Goburn, had completely spiraled out of control. And I reckon that if some of those people that joined Angoff, and Flamank back in Cornwall, had known what they were letting themselves in for, they would probably have made straight for home. But they're in it now. The die is cast. It's too late. And it is said that when the rebel army started to lose heart, and in fact, a message was smuggled out to Daubeny by somebody within the rebel camp, asking him to mediate on their behalf and offering to hand over the leaders as sureties. Other people were all for just simply surrendering, and others simply vanished into the night. Although, if you're Cornish, it's not, it's all right around disappearing Kent. How on earth are you going to get home? You might not speak the language. You've got a hostile population, so there was nowhere for them to go. And so, probably because they really had no alternative, a substantial number of the Cornish and their supporters, Devon, Dorset, Somerset, and so on, they decided to fight on. And early on the following day, that was Saturday, the 17th of June, Henry's forces struck. Now, actually, this was crafty by Henry because he spread the rumour that he was going to attack on the following Monday. He said, I can't attack on a Sunday because, it's a holy day. I'm going to attack on the Monday. But actually, he attacked early. He caught them by surprise. Now, looking at that area now, it's quite extensively built up. But some of the features of the area still remain. So we have Blackheath, and you can imagine that where that settlement is in the middle of the grass, so you imagine that the rebel camp with their dispirited rebels up there. And then over to the west, so over to the left as we look at this picture, the land drops down very steeply down to Deptford. Now, Deptford meant deep ford, incidentally. Well, it's all built up now, as you can see, but you see the land goes down. And at the bottom down there was the road. This is the road to London Bridge. And it crosses over a river called the Ravensbourne, which goes up into the Thames. And there was a bridge there. Well, Daubeny and was going to have to get across that bridge. And the Cornish realised that. And it appears that Audley actually placed a force of archers to cover the bridge. Now, the account suggests that the Cornish and their allies were equipped in the traditional bills and bows, that sort of thing. They didn't have any horse cavalry, they didn't have any guns, but they had bowmen and they had billmen and spearmen. And the idea was that the archers would cover that crossing at the bottom of that hill over the Ravensbourne, while the bulk of the Cornish rebel force drew up as best as it could up on Blackheath to the east. So behind this picture that I'm showing here. Well, here's the situation. So over on the left here, you can see the crossing at Deptford, where the Cornish bowmen are deployed. And then up on the top of Blackheath, that sort of amorphous blue mass is the not particularly well-disciplined Cornish protesters come rebels. And you can see how the royalists dealt with this situation. They split their forces. And while Daubeny led an attack on the Deptford Bridge from the west there, the rest of Henry's army, under the Earls of Oxford, Essex and Suffolk, moved round to the south, and they attacked the rebels in the flank and rear. So the Cornish and the rebels are being squeezed now in two directions. And it does appear that the Cornish archers down at Deptford put up quite a stout resistance. But the problem was that they're too far away from the top of the hill. So they're very isolated down there. And it was almost impossible for Audley and co to send any reinforcements down there. I think the army was, their so-called army was so disorganized that just the discipline of doing that would have been impossible anyway. So eventually, Daubeny's spearmen fought their way across the bridge. They suffered quite heavy casualties in doing so, but they got across the bridge. So they're now down on the western slopes of Blackheath and fighting their way up. It seems that Daubeny, incidentally, led from the front because he got across the bridge and he got captured by the rebels. And you think, well, what's going to happen to him? Well, they let him go. And I think the reason for this is that they realised that the game was up and they were hoping that perhaps he'd put in a good word for them. And so Daubeny's troops are forcing their way up the hill now. Meanwhile, the main Royal Army is now attacking from the south, and the Cornish disintegrate. The army disintegrates, really, and many were slain in the fighting. Estimates range on this. We just don't know. Some accounts say 200, others say 2,000. We don't know. But the rest of the rebels, most of them were captured, actually. Now, there wasn't wholesale executions, in fact. Many of the Cornish were sort of allowed to go, really. But that's not the case for the leadership. So Audley, Angoff, and Flamanck, all of these would be executed. Now, as an aristocrat, Audley received the privilege of being quickly beheaded rather than being slowly hanged, although not before being humiliated. The account for this still exists, where they made a sort of torn paper surcoat with his coat of arms on it, all defaced, and he was paraded round, and then he was beheaded. Now, it's sometimes claimed, and again, you read this a lot in accounts, that Angoff and Flamanck were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, this, of course, is a very grisly fate on the face of it, which involved being hanged to the point where you're nearly dead, and then you're cut down and disemboweled. But more often than not, people were drawn, hanged, and quartered. And it's a significant difference. And basically, the drawing is simply that you're dragged on a hurdle to where you're hanged. But it's so dramatic to say hanged, drawn, and quartered that people like to think about all the sort of awful aspects of that. But this is what the Chronicle of London says about it. So this is written at the time. It says, the smith, so that's Angoff, and Flamanck, were drawn, in other words, dragged on hurdles from the tower and the hanged until they were dead, and after struck down and beheaded, and after quartered. Now, it was customary at that time for quartered bodies to be displayed in their places of origin as a warning to others. But Henry recognised, actually, that this would simply inflame Cornish sensibilities. So he decided not to do that. What he did, in fact, was he displayed their remains around London, and the heads of Flamanck and Angoff joined that of Audley on London Bridge. But it said about Henry that here he is, that the less blood he drew, the more he drew in treasure. And this was certainly the case after Blackheath. There were no mass executions, as I say, but if you were found to have been involved in the rebellion, you were hit with heavy fines. This is classic Henry, isn't it? We think about Henry VII. So, and it's estimated that he netted £15,000 simply in fining people, which was a large amount of money at the time. Obviously, it's not 120,000 that he needed for the rebellion, but just by fining the people that were involved in this in this rebellion, it's quite a substantial amount of money. And it's useful for us because the accounts of who was fined still survive. And so it's through that we know who got involved in the rebellion. And we know, for example, that a lot more people from Dorset and Somerset were involved in the rising than we first thought. So, you know, even so, despite the lack of executions, or perhaps because of the heavy fines, I don't know, many of the Cornish would soon rise again, this time in support of the pretender Perkin Warbeck. But that's another story. So a little later after this, they support Perkin Warbeck. So what about Daubney? So, you know, the fact that Daubney is buried in this magnificent tomb that you can see here next to his wife Elizabeth, who incidentally was born in Cornwall. Ironically, she was born in Cornwall. I think this is perhaps evidence that, you know, he still prospered. He wasn't without, you know, enemies at court. He was fined for various things, but Henry was wont to do that. But the fact that he ends up buried in Westminster Abbey, whereas Audley, there's no burial for him, I think it says everything